was hot in question period today. Back and forth, especially over the veterans issue. Veterans Affairs Minister Julian Fantino again under fire in the House. Again, the Prime Minister came to his defense. The battle over care for veterans is raging. More calls for the minister to resign, more calls for changes. Opposition parties accusing the government of cutting critical programs for vets, fudging the numbers to soften the blow. You just heard the Prime Minister fighting back, saying, well, the opposition parties are all rhetoric. They don't vote with the Conservatives on key issues, and they say the Conservatives are taking concrete steps to help vets. So as that's going on, don't lose sight of the fact that another fight is going on in BC. The federal government, right now, as we are speaking to each other right now, are fighting a group of veterans in court over benefits. They're arguing there is no social obligation to retired soldiers. And 6 vets have taken the government to court. We're going to hear from retired Major Mark Campbell in a bit. He lost both his legs to an IED attack in Afghanistan. He's on the front lines of this battle against the government. But he's part of this lawsuit when it comes to who's at fault here. So there's lots of questions. Is the government balancing the books on the backs of those who served in uniform? Is Mr. Fantino up for the job as Veterans Affairs Minister? Joining me now, Conservative MP Erin O'Toole, NDP Defence critic Jack Harris, and the Liberal Veterans Affairs critic Frank Valeriot. Mr. O'Toole, let me start with you. You know there's a huge controversy around calls for Minister Fantino to resign over all sorts of different issues. In the meantime, there's this court case going on in British Columbia. The government is arguing in court it does not have a social contract with veterans. There are 6 veterans involved in a lawsuit there. Why does the government believe there's no social contract with veterans?
Well, Evan, we clearly believe that there's a huge obligation the country owes its veterans, and it has throughout its history and does to today. The issue in the court case, and I've met with the principals from Equitas and have studied the court case closely as both a veteran and a lawyer, you know, this duty they're arguing in court is trying to compare the same sort of level of constitutional duty that the government owes to First Nations. And I think, you know, you can separate clearly a strong obligation to make sure veterans are well served, but not put it on a constitutional basis that the obligation owed to the First Nations. That's what's really being argued in that passage you're referring to, which uses language from Robert Borden, my favorite Prime Minister, who talked about a sacred obligation and how critical that was to the country in World War I. And that's all true, but it doesn't equate to the same sort of constitutional basis for rights as First Nations have.
Now, I spoke to Major Mark Campbell. He's one of the veterans involved in the lawsuit. He'll be on the program today as well. He lost both his legs in an IED attack in Afghanistan. He did 2 tours of duty there. In 2008, he lost both his legs. Let me show you what he told me about his experience in Veterans Affairs and why he's involved in this lawsuit.
But the young guys are the ones that are really being worked over by this new Veterans Charter. And I tell you, a lot of them are on the brink. Families are imploding. So, you know, these guys are thinking that they're worth more dead than alive with their insurance policies because the SISIP insurance policy, you know, doesn't have a suicide clause. So these things enter people's minds as hard, cold financial realities, and then they eat a bullet.
He's basically saying they're in court because the new Veterans Charter is putting new veterans of the Afghanistan conflict at serious risk. He's passionate about it. He's served for more than 30 years. What do you tell him when he's fighting his government in court to get what he sees as his benefits?
Well, I'd tell him, Evan, that we're listening to the concerns on the new Veterans Charter, and I'm glad, and I spoke to Equitas about this. The new Veterans Charter was brought in by Frank's party, the Liberal Party. All parties at the time in the Commons voted on it. In our government, we've already made significant changes to it, particularly for critically injured veterans who have difficulty or an impossible time transitioning to a career post-military because of their serious injuries. So we've added the permanent impairment allowance and supplement to make sure that those people are provided for life. And we're listening to feedback from the Ombudsman as well on this very point.
But you're taking these guys, you tried to get the government tried to get the court case tossed. Now you're in the BC Supreme Court said sorry. Now the government's taking these. This is a vet who's lost his legs to the appeals court. Does that send the right message to vets?
I think vets are proud and smart people as well, and I think they would say, make sure that your programs are meeting the new needs of veterans, make sure they're generous, and make sure that your improvements to VAC are veteran-focused. I don't think if veterans look at the case, they would say that veterans fall into a special constitutional category like Aboriginal peoples or something like this. We live in a democracy where it's important for us to make sure that if there's problems with the new veteran charter the Liberals brought in, we've got to fix it.
Right.
The good thing is there were 14 recommendations made on an all-party basis. We've already moved on 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah.
I think there's an intention to move on many of them, and those are being looked at right now. The biggest one of which is that we're not allowing anyone to be transferred out of the Canadian Forces to become a veteran until their medical situation is stabilized.
Right.
That has been a big failure in the past, and I think if we implement some of these changes, I think Mr. Campbell will see a lot of improvements.
Well, I'll tell you, wait till you hear what he has to say later in the program. I'll tell you straight out, his view and your view, they're very, very different. I'll let him speak later. Mr. Harris, what's your view of the case and how this is being handled?
Well, you know what? Mr. O'Toole's words are fine words, but they're just that, words. I mean, the reality is that this case was brought on the basis of commitments made by governments years ago, but not just by governments. I mean, General Hillier made the same kind of commitment when he was asking people to go to Afghanistan. The soldiers know that this was the expectation, that they would be looked after if they were hurt, their families would be looked after if they were killed. So they feel that as a solemn obligation, the unlimited liability that soldiers take on, and Aaron O'Toole as a soldier knows that. But the case, as you pointed out, the government tried to get him thrown out of court. When they won in the Supreme Court, it was believed to be a great victory because they thought the government would then sit down and work out and resolve the problem face to face. They didn't do that. Now they're in the Court of Appeal trying to do the same thing, basically saying we have no legal obligation to our veterans. I think that's a slap in the face to the commitments that they've been asked to make, to the sacrifices that they've made, and to the circumstances they're in now. It's all very well to say that we don't kick them out of the military unless their situation is stabled. Well, unfortunately, the stabilization takes place in coincidentally a lot of time at 9 years before they're even eligible for a pension.
Frank Valeriot, your leader, said that there's a sacred obligation. Is that the same thing as a social contract?
It's a social contract and a sacred obligation. And if we define it, it's based on the fact that our veterans, when they were in a theater of war, put their lives on the line, prepared to die. And through that, they suffer and their families suffer. And that obligation is owed to them and to their families. And it manifests itself in how we treat them when they get home. And so, yes, it is a higher...
It was your government that brought the charter, right?
Absolutely, yeah, they brought the charter.
And they're saying that the lump sum is a violation of their rights.
No. They brought the charter in, the New Veterans Charter, at the end of their mandate. It was intended as a living document to be interpreted depending on the circumstances of the day, the theater of battle, the different nuances associated, different needs associated with different battle. It was intended to develop over time. And that was handed to the Conservative government in 2006 because we had no opportunity as government to actually implement it. We lost power. And what we see is that it's been abused. A lump sum is given. It's inadequate. It's insufficient. It's inaccessible. Those are 3 things that the Veterans Ombudsman says are vital if we're going to serve our veterans properly. They have low amounts. They're lower lump sum amounts than you get in a civil court for an accident injury, for goodness sakes. They are owed more than people who suffer from some kind of whiplash and are trying to claim from an insurance company. They are owed everything to look after them and their families, and they have to be given in sufficient amounts that they can get to the end of their life. And that's the problem. A small lump sum is given and it's spent. And they do not have the opportunity nor the amount
Evan,
to invest and have it paid over time.
I have to correct Frank on that. The lump sum, for critically wounded veterans like the one you had on, Mr. Campbell, that has a serious impairment like that, there will be a lump sum up front, but there will also be permanent impairment allowance and supplement, which is essentially a pension. What they should have just done is called it a pension.
Yeah, but
there's much more than just the lump sum.
But for new young vets who might have been injured early, right? They don't have a big salary. Then they do get the lump sum, but what they get after is based on their salary, which is low. There's a basis up to $40,000 now, but then it's taxable. So, I mean, if you're in your late 20s or early 30s, you got 40 years to live, and you've lost your legs in an IED attack from the Afghan conflict, sir. You and I both know it's not a lot of money.
That's
and
right.
then you've got a reservist too. If you've got a reservist whose situation is where their pay is related to their service and their pay, you've got a different situation
Okay, hang
entirely.
on.
So
And what's telling?
there's a lot of problems there that have not been resolved, and the department, in addition to trying to kick this case out of court, has gotten rid of 1,000 Veterans Affairs employees who were supposed to be trying to implement these policies.
And Evan,
I
what's
got 10
telling?
seconds.
What's telling? The committee even agreed that the lump sum has to be reviewed. It went back to Mr. Fantino. He said he would embrace that report, and he's done nothing. Not a word, not a mention of veterans in the fall updated budget. Not a word.
Okay, Mr. O'Toole, 10 seconds. Will the size of the lump sum change?
I think if you look at all 14 recommendations, and Frank's on that committee, I used to be, there's going to be movement on most of them, I think. Some there already is, and I think it's about, the new Veterans Charter is supposed to be a living charter, and is.
Right.
It seems like Frank and the party that brought it in is now disavowing it. So maybe Prime Minister Martin and Bill Graham and those people made mistakes. And Justin should just say that if that's the case.
For 6 months and not been implemented.
That's right.
That's hardly a living document.
That's right.
There are lots to come. Aaron O'Toole, and Jack Harris, and Frank Valera. Always good to have the three of you on,
Thank you.
and I appreciate that very much. And we'll hear from one of the key people, one of the vets involved in this lawsuit later in the program. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.